everybody. Thanks for coming. We are glad you're here joining us for another one of our Green Living Seminar presentations. So this semester, the Green Living Seminar has focused on the theme Rewilding Our World. All of these presentations take place here at MCLA in the Feigenbaum Center for Science and Innovation, room 121, Wednesdays, 5:30 p.m., always free and open to the public. And if you would like to see the schedule, get a link to our YouTube page with recordings of prior presentations, and also the presentation today, the slides and resources will be posted there. Our website is www.mcla.edu/greenliving. I'm Dr. Elena Traster in the Environmental Studies Department here at MCLA, and I would like to invite you to come back next week on Wednesday, April 23rd. Dr. Oz Schmitz, Osler Professor of Population and Community Ecology at the Yale School of the Environment, will present our final lecture titled Rewilding to Combat Climate Change. Today's presentation, titled Rewilding for Pollinators, will be given by Amy Meltzer, co-chair of the Massachusetts Pollinator Network Steering Committee.
Thank you.
Thanks so much.
Hi, everybody. I'm really glad you're here. I'm going to talk just for a second about the Pollinator Network, because I know there's people in this room that want to find ways to get involved and take action. I'm also going to give you a whole bunch of information on the resource slides at the end. So if you go to the website, you'll get that. That's even more ways to connect. But the Pollinator Network started a few years ago, and really our purpose is to be a hub of resources and information and a place for people to connect around doing work to support and restore pollinators and pollinator habitat. So we have a website, we have a brown bag lunch on Zoom every month where anybody can show up and ask questions and share information. We have a speaker series. We're also now closely involved with Grow Native Massachusetts, which has been around for maybe 15 years. They also have a great website and lots of information, so there's just a lot of ways to keep getting educated and connect with people. So tonight, that's what I'm going to talk about, how to provide habitat for pollinators and other wildlife that all interact and depend on each other. So first, I'm going to give a brief introduction to the biodiversity crisis, because that's why doing this work is so important. Then I'll be talking about how native plants and trees are interdependent with insects and birds and other species, and that we really need to be thinking about the ecology of supporting all these species. And I'll talk about ways to garden or manage landscapes to support biodiversity. And then if there's time, I'm going to quickly just show you what's in the resource slides. And if there isn't time, you can just find them and look for them. But I'd like to show you what's in there if I manage to get there in time. So I have two slides of bad news, and then I'm going to get to what we can actually do about all this. So the UN over the last few years and other research groups have been putting out reports saying that climate change and biodiversity loss are actually equally threatening to our existence. But part of the reason why I like talking about rewilding so much is that the biodiversity loss gets so much less attention and less action, and we really do need to be taking action on that too. Around the world, there are about 1 million animal and plant species declining in numbers and at risk of extinction. As I just said, we do need to deal with these together. In the US, 34% of plant species, 40% of animal species, and 41% of our ecosystems are at risk of extinction. Since 1970, actually this is a tiny bit outdated now, we've lost about 3 billion birds just in North America. And a major reason for this is that for most birds, at some point in their life cycle, they depend on insects for food. Either the adults are eating the insects or they're feeding them to their young, often in the form of caterpillars. I'll talk about that a little more later. And the insect species are declining at such a fast rate that they could be gone by the end of the century if we don't do something about that. A report just came out that we've lost 22% of our butterflies just in the US since 2000. And in Massachusetts, there are 400 species of native bees, many of them declining. So this is the moment where I like to say, I think everyone grows up learning about honeybees. And they're very cool, and they're very interesting, and they're actually not native to our hemisphere. They are not at risk of extinction, and they compete with native bees for resources. So one of my resource slides has articles and videos about that if someone wants to learn more about that. But I like to tell people, because a lot of people think getting a hive is a great way to help the environment, and it actually isn't. So it's not too late for us to take action to make things better. And I also really like this quote by E.O. Wilson, who died a couple of years ago. He was an American biologist. He said, "If all mankind were to disappear, the world would regenerate back to the rich state of equilibrium that existed 10,000 years ago. If insects were to vanish, the environment would collapse into chaos." And I think I kind of want to hear from the younger people if this is still true, but I think most of us grow up thinking of insects as being dangerous or disgusting or just insignificant. I mean, if you look up insects, if you Google them, usually the first thing that pops up is pesticide companies. You know, it's like the first urge is just to kill them. And in fact, insects are essential for the functioning of all ecosystems. They pollinate many of our food crops, so there's a lot of produce we would not have without insects. They pollinate 90% of flowering plants, so those plants can't reproduce without insects. They are food for many species, as you can see in that picture, and then in turn, there are many species that eat the species that eat insects. I just learned that in the Pacific Northwest, grizzly bears eat 10 to 20,000 moth larvae a day in the summertime. That's a major food source for them. So who would have thought that bears are depending on insects? But they are. That's just one example out of many, many. They're also really important for decomposition. Everything that dies needs to get broken down into nutrients. Insects help with that. They're also active in soil, and they help sequester carbon. So they're helping us deal with climate change. So the causes of insect decline are many, but by far the greatest cause is loss of habitat. So included in that is industrial agriculture, you know, huge fields of monocrops that are often soaked with pesticides, as are the perimeter of the fields that used to be places where wild plants would grow. Deforestation is a big loss of habitat for many species. Urbanization, I mean, it really is possible and important to plant in cities too. There's a lot of evidence that we can support a lot of species in cities with gardens, with greenways, even with pots on a porch. But if everything's paved over and we're not planting, then there's no habitat there. So another loss of habitat is the widespread use of non-native plants. And that is most of what's in our gardens, and it's most of what's in our plant nurseries. And I'll be talking later about how those do not support our local ecosystem. And then we also have a lot of landscape practices that most people practice that also are destructive to habitat, and I'll talk about that. Pesticides, herbicides, and fertilizers are all damaging and destructive to insects. Invasive plants and insects are destructive to habitat. I'll talk a little about how light pollution is also damaging to insect life as well as other species. And then, of course, climate change. You know, when we have floods and fires and searing heat, obviously that's not helping species survive. So in this section, I'm going to talk about how these species have come to be interdependent. And most of the photos are from my own garden. So I want to give a few definitions. Native plants are plants that co-evolved with other species in a given ecoregion, and they offer multiple benefits to each other. So people define the boundaries of what's native in many different ways. Some people will only want to buy plants from their county or their state or New England, but some people will go east of the Mississippi and north of the Appalachian Mountains, so there's decisions to make about that. But the important thing is there's an interaction between the plant and other local species that's beneficial. Non-native plants are plants that have been brought here from other continents or from other ecoregions, like California is a totally different ecoregion than what we have here. So even plants that were brought here 400 years ago from other regions don't provide the same support to our local insects and birds as plants that evolved here. And I'll show you some research about that. And then invasive plants are plants that grow very aggressively and they crowd out native plants. Some of them, as you can see in this picture, just grow huge vines and smother things to the point where they can take down trees. Other exude chemicals from their roots that poison surrounding plants, and they keep taking over territory that way. But anyway, that's another kind of habitat loss, is when you have invasive plants. They're taking over territory that we need for native plants. So insects and plants have been co-evolving for 125 million years. And the result is, and actually Charles Darwin discovered that they are actually depending on each other, that insects are pollinating the plants. And for a long time, people had seen that insects were visiting plants, but he's the one who figured out that they actually have this mutually beneficial, interdependent relationship. So plants depend on insects to pollinate them so they can reproduce. Insects are depending on plants for food, for themselves, and for their offspring, and I'll go into a little detail about that. Plants protect themselves from being devoured by insects with several defense mechanisms, and a major one is that they produce chemicals that make them either toxic or unpalatable to insects. So that limits the insects that can visit them. And insects have evolved ways to bypass the toxicity and be able to manage it and digest it, but only for specific plants. And the result of this is that 90% of insects need certain plants for food and can't survive without them, either to feed themselves or, again, to feed their offspring. And most plants can only be pollinated by limited species of insects. So they've evolved these really fascinating symbiotic chemical and physical traits that enable them to interact and provide benefit to each other. The more I learn about this, the more amazing it is. So insects can sense and respond to flower color, including some colors we can't see, like ultraviolet. They see pattern. You can see they develop shapes that match the flower, like this bumblebee that fits so nicely into that tubular flower. They can smell the scent of flowers. They sense temperature. Electromagnetic fields come into this. There's some insects that are very fuzzy, and it helps pollen stick to them, but they can also sense plants that have an opposite charge, and it helps them find the plants they need. And I just learned that bumblebees, some bumblebees, when they visit flowers and they've taken the nectar, they leave a scent on the flower that tells other bumblebees, don't bother, there's not much food here. And as the scent diminishes, the nectar replenishes. So that's an amazing symbiotic relationship that's going on. There's so many examples, but I'll keep going. And then most imported plants, the ones that are brought here from other places, and most plants that are hybridized, which are plants that humans have altered in order to make a different shape or make a different color that they're going to put into their plant nursery, most of those have also lost their ability to benefit insects. And I'll give more information about that too. So I just want to give you a few examples of these specialized relationships that have evolved over such a long period of time. So I learned just in the last few years that insects have different length tongues. And there are long-tongued bees and long-tongued moths that pollinate the flowers that have long tubular petals because they can reach down and get the nectar. And hummingbirds also can pollinate those shapes. That's the only pollinating bird in North America. There are other insects that have shorter tongues that can land on, an open-faced flower and get nectar from it. So that's one example. Here's another. There's some flowers that have really thick, closed petals. The blue gentian on the far left, actually I have a video of that, but this is a PDF, so I can't show you. But Only bumblebees are big and strong enough to push their way into those flowers. Then here's an example of a specialized chemical relationship which you've probably heard about, which is the relationship between monarch butterflies and milkweed plants. So that's a monarch egg on that leaf on the far left. And monarch butterflies can get nectar from a lot of different flowers, but they lay their eggs on milkweed because when the caterpillar hatches, that's the only thing it can eat, is milkweed leaves. There's actually an invasive plant called black swallowwort, which is in the same family, and when monarchs lay their eggs on that and the caterpillars hatch, it poisons them. So that's another reason to get rid of an invasive plant. So that's called a host plant, when there's just one plant that feeds the young of insects, and I'll give some more examples of that. So another thing bumblebees do is called buzz pollination. They vibrate at a certain frequency that shakes pollen loose. So there's some plants that they can pollinate much more effectively than any other insect, including many of our crops. So that's a tomato plant, and there's blueberries. So here's a little more about host plants. Moths and butterflies lay their eggs on plants, mostly on leaves. And when the eggs hatch, the caterpillars eat their leaves. And I'll show you research that there are thousands of caterpillars needed to feed one nest of baby birds. And most caterpillars can eat the leaves only of certain plants. So those are the host plants for Lepidoptera, which is the word for moths and butterflies. So that's a spicebush swallowtail butterfly. That's its very cute caterpillar that can only eat sassafras or spicebush. And then something similar happens for bees. So I want to, again, explain here, we're used to thinking about honeybees living in hives of thousands of bees all living together. Most native bees are solitary. They dig tunnels in the ground, they dig tunnels in wood, and they collect pollen from plants to store in those nests. They place pollen balls next to the eggs, and when the eggs hatch, they eat the pollen. And as you know, a similar story with butterflies, most of these larvae can only eat pollen from very specific plants. So those are the host plants for bees. So again, in the resource slides, I'll show you, there's spreadsheets of those plants. So if you're wanting to plant host plants, you'll know which ones are beneficial. So what this means is caterpillars are going to be eating the leaves of their host plants. And again, contrary to how I think most of us are taught, instead of looking at holes in leaves and going, oh no, what's wrong? I have an infestation, get out the spray bottle. You think, wow, this is exciting. There's caterpillars eating these leaves. Nature is doing its job. They're going to grow up to either become pollinating insects or they'll be food for birds. And if the holes in the leaves bother you, you can just step back and look at that big, healthy tree. When you step, the tree is fine. Evolution has made this work, so everybody is happy. So this is the research about how many caterpillars are needed. So Desiree Narango was a student of Doug Tallamy, who you may have heard about. He's done a lot of this really groundbreaking, wonderful research on the interdependence of native plants and insects. He's an entomologist. He has wonderful talks and books, again, in the resource slides if you want to find out more about him. So she was studying how many native woody plants were needed to support chickadees, those little black and white birds. And she was looking at woody plants because those have far more foliage than herbaceous perennials. Like, you know, milkweed supports butterflies, but if you think about all the leaves on an oak tree or a maple tree, they can support lots more caterpillars than one milkweed plant. So what she found is if the amount of native woody plants in the neighborhood dropped below 70%, the birds starved. There just wasn't enough food in the neighborhood for them. So if you think about it, if you need 6,000 to 9,000 caterpillars to raise one nest, you need a lot of native leaves that the caterpillars can eat, that the birds can collect to feed to the baby birds. So if you don't have enough native trees and shrubs around, then you can't support the bird population. So people are using this as a kind of rule of thumb, like how much native plants should you aim for? And we're talking about native plant biomass, so you're not estimating the number of plants, but the amount of native plant material. And so the rule of thumb is 70% as a minimum to be able to keep the ecosystem functional. So this is a little bit of data showing how non-native plants don't support our local species. So the list of plants on the left are all plants from other continents. The numbers right next to those names show how many species they support in their home country. So that's between 40 and 400. The next column shows how many species they support in North America, which is between 0 and 8. And then the next column shows how long they've been here, which is between 100 and over 300 years. So that kind of evolution just doesn't happen quickly. I think the digestive system and all the enzymes are complicated, and that doesn't change fast. And just a quick comparison of trees. Ginkgo trees are native to China. They support one species in the US, and they've been here over 240 years. Native oak trees support over 500 insect species. They also support birds, they support mammals. It's actually the best plant for supporting the most species possible. So on average, native plants support 13 times more insect species than non-natives, and non-native plants on average support 0 to 5 insect species. So I told you I'd talk about hybridized plants. So I'm using Echinacea as an example. So this picture was taken in Cummington at a really wonderful native plant nursery. You can see all the different kind of butterflies on the Echinacea. So native plant species will provide nectar for adult insects. They'll provide pollen and leaves for the offspring. They provide seed for birds. And they also have genetic variability, which is really important. It's always been important. I think it's even more important now with climate change. If all the plants are cloned, which is what you will find in conventional nurseries, they're all genetically identical. If you have an adverse event like a pest or a flood or a heat wave, they could all be wiped out. If there's genetic variability, each plant has slightly different characteristics, and there might be some that survive and go on and reproduce. So whenever you can, if you're buying native plants, get seed-grown plants because they'll have some variation in them. So to find the straight species, it will have a Latin name, like this is Echinacea purpurea, with no name after it. And I'll show you in contrast, the hybrid plants, which again have been altered by humans, they're given a name in quotes. So this is Echinacea purpurea sunrise on the top there. So most hybridized plants, some of them retain their ecological value. Many of them, like this one on the bottom, has no nectar, no seeds, and no pollen. Some of them have reduced nutrition in their nectar or pollen because people are changing them for characteristics to please humans, either the shape or the color or the amount of bloom time. Some of them, the shape has changed, so it looks like it should be fine, but it's not. Like there's Lobelia cardinalis has long red tubular flowers. There's a hybrid where the flowers have been enlarged, and those long-tongued insects can't reach the nectar anymore. You wouldn't know it from looking at it. But so now if I see a name, with the quotes after it, unless I know it's ecologically valuable, I think, that might not be good for feeding insects. And then they're also cloned, so there's no genetic variation. So I also want to say there's a lot of nurseries and plant catalogs that are kind of jumping on the pollinator bandwagon and saying, these are great for pollinators. And often they're hybrids or they're seeds that are from other areas. So it helps to find out, is this really a local plant that's native to this region? And some native plants are more beneficial than others. There's about 5% of native plant species that feed 75% of insect species. So those are known as keystone plants. I have a list of those in the resource slides. Then there are plants that support the endangered insects in our region. So Rob Gajir is a researcher at UMass, and I have a spreadsheet of his plants. So those are good to plant too when you're adding native plants to get the ones that are going to help the species that are at risk. So I want to talk a little about soil health, because that's another part of the ecosystem that's really essential. The picture of the fibers, those are called mycorrhizal fungi. It's this fiber system underground that's on all continents. There are thousands of different species. When they're getting ready to reproduce, they send mushrooms up. So that's the part of them that we're familiar with, is, you know, after a rain, seeing mushrooms. But when the mushrooms are gone, those fibers are still underground. They connect to roots of plants. They transfer nutrients and water and carbon between plants and into the soil. They protect plants from disease. What they're getting out of this is they don't photosynthesize, so they're getting nutrients from the plants. So it's this interdependent health and nutrition system. And they are really important to the functioning of ecosystems. They're also really important. Soil stores a lot of our carbon emissions, and a lot of it is due to the function of these mycorrhizal fungi. So I'll talk a little later about how to protect soil health. So here I'm going to talk about gardening for biodiversity. This is from my backyard in Cambridge, and it used to be vinca and hostas and Japanese grass. And now it has all these different shade species, which some of them bloom. It's not blooming now, but I think all the different textures and shapes are still really interesting. So I talked about habitat as being, loss of habitat as being a major cause for this decline in species. We don't have enough wild habitat left outside of our developed lands to make up for the loss of habitat. There's 40 million acres in the US are in lawns, which is equal to the continental national park acreage. In Massachusetts, 20% of our land is lawn. And lawns are ecosystem deserts. There are ways to make them more beneficial than a conventional lawn, but usually it's, you know, one monocrop, not native, using tons of water. Basically, they're keeping the soil from blowing away. They're not supporting anything. And then look at this little strip of native flowering plants right next to a hot street. And they're not all native, but a lot of them are. And I'll show you the difference between that, what that can do and what lawns can do. So the far left, that little mustache, is turf grass. And all those other plants are native plants. The roots can absorb water from storms. They're storing carbon. They're supporting all these different shapes and sizes of flowers, which will support the whole variety of insects. They'll provide seed for birds. Some of them are also providing shelter for bees. Some of them, you know, make their nests under the leaves and grasses that are sheltering the soil. So they're just vastly more beneficial than having a lawn. So Doug Tallamy, the entomologist I was talking about, has a website called Homegrown National Park, which keeps getting more and more great information added to it. I really recommend visiting that. He's recommending planting half our lawns with at least 70% native habitat. So, I mean, this is a big, expensive example of doing that. That house is in the western suburbs of Boston. It used to be all grass. Now those are all native trees and shrubs and grasses. It's wonderful habitat. A lot of people don't have that space and don't have that money, but you can put a window box of native plants on a porch. You can have like a 5-foot square native garden. Anything you can do is really helpful. If you do have a lawn, you can think about, what are you actually using it for? Like, do you need it for soccer? Do you need it for people to hang out on? What parts of it are you not using? And can you turn that into habitat? And leave walking paths, leave recreation, and, you know, make it beneficial. There are other ways to make lawns beneficial. This left side has been allowed to grow tall and has clover and other flowers in it. The right side is mown really short. So if you mow every 2 to 3 weeks, let grass get 3 to 4 inches tall, leave the grass clippings as fertilizer, don't use any chemicals on it, and allow or add small flowering plants, you'll get insects visiting the flowers in the lawn. You'll get birds coming after them looking for food because they eat insects, and you'll have some wildlife in your lawn. Again, it's better to have trees and shrubs and flowering plants, but if you have lawn, this is one way you can make it beneficial. So if you want to start with planting native plants, it's similar to starting any garden. You need to know what kind of sun and shade do you have. Do you have dry or wet soil? And just think about, do you want to add native plants to a garden you already have? Do you want to start a new garden bed? Do you want to make use of a lawn? You can add trees, you can make it into a meadow, you can just use part of it for a flower garden. And then if you plant in vertical layers, ground covers, flowering plants, taller perennials, shrubs, trees, and vines, that's what happens naturally in nature. And nature also lets things grow close together and touch each other. Nature doesn't have mulch around every plant. I think that's for the convenience of landscapers. So, dense plantings of all different sizes, whatever you can fit, whatever's comfortable to start with, that's all beneficial. And then you always need to be checking for invasive plants and removing them. So there's also some details. I think if people have been thinking about supporting pollinators, what most people think about is providing flowering plants, which is really important. There are ways to do that for the most benefit. Having a variety of plants, again, I talked about all the variety of insects. Variety of plants in bloom from spring through fall because insects need them that whole growing season. If you plant in groups of 3 to 5, it looks nice for us to kind of have a massive flower. Again, this is ideally, and if you have room. If you don't have room, you do whatever you can, and it's fine. But it also is helpful for native insects. Honeybees can fly miles. Most native bees and other pollinators fly yards. So if the flowers are in one area, it's easy for them to forage and get the nutrients they need without wearing themselves out flying around too much. Using the keystone plants that I mentioned is important. The plants that support endangered insects, growing 70% native biomass, and then again, including all these different kinds of native plants are all going to be beneficial. And then, just like us, insects need more than food. They also need shelter. So for the native bees that nest in the ground, it's helpful to have some bare soil. For the native bees that nest in cavities, in dead wood, in hollow stems, I'll talk a little bit about how to manage your garden to provide that. But leaving areas where they can nest is helpful. If you have room to have dead wood in your garden, sheltered areas with brush piles, they can use those for nests too. And then to provide shelter year-round, again, this is different from how most people are taught to garden, which is to, if anything's brown, take it out of your garden in the fall. And actually, that's all habitat. You want to leave it. You want to leave the fallen leaves. You want to leave the plant stems standing all winter because there are a lot of insects that nest in the stems. They either hibernate there or they lay eggs there. So whenever you throw those out, you're throwing away the next generation of insects. People who have these beautiful groves of trees and no leaves under them, they're, again, throwing away the insects, but they're also taking the nutrients away from the trees. I mean, again, with evolution, the leaves fall, they break down, and they become fertilizer. So, there are natural cycles that we've been taught to interrupt that you'll save a lot of time and money buying fertilizer if you just kind of let those natural processes happen. And then also when you leave those stems standing, you have seeds that will be up all winter, and birds will come and eat them. So, and then the other natural objects I talked about, if you can leave them, they're all providing shelter. So I know some people live in places where the neighbors kind of freak out if you don't have a traditional looking yard. And there are things you can do to show them that you're doing this on purpose, like mow around the edges or put up a pollinator sign. There's more information about that online if that's a big problem where you live. Oh, and then actually I skipped saying this. The other advantage to leaving all these things up in the winter is that it's beautiful. You have different shapes and colors of plants that are drying out. And then in the winter it snows and they look like sculpture. I mean, we're used to having everything kind of stripped clean and look tidy, but there's just this beauty that nature provides that we're not used to, and it's wonderful to start seeing it. So what do you do in the spring after you've left everything lying around all winter? So if you have places where you can just leave the leaves safely, that's fine. You don't want to have thick leaves, wet leaves on a lawn because it will rot it. I will move, if I have thick layers of leaves, I kind of move them away from the plant crowns as they're emerging. And if I have too many, I'll make a pile of leaves, and it just breaks down into wonderful mulch and fertilizer. And then for the plant stems, no matter when you cut them down, you'll be doing some damage. So if you have places where you can just leave them, that's great. If you have a garden and you want it to look like a garden and not a meadow, then you may want to cut them. So you wait till you have almost a week of weather in the 50s during the day, and then cut them 12 to 18 inches. Put the stalks off to the side somewhere because the insects still may emerge from them. The plants will grow up around the stubble that you've left. And if you just leave that, insects will again use those in the coming years. So those are good ways to manage your property so it still looks like a garden and you're still providing benefit to local species. Wow, the wind is picking up out there. I can hear it. So to protect soil health, I talked about how important the mycorrhizal fungi are. Minimizing tilling is really helpful. So obviously if you're pulling leaves or planting something, you're going to disturb the soil, you're going to dig a hole, but just don't dig more than you need to. It protects both the fungi and it protects the bees that are nesting in the soil. Always avoid artificial chemicals. They injures insects, it injures the soil, the health of the soil organisms. There's 1 billion microorganisms in a teaspoon of soil. There's a lot going on in there. So, just leave things alone as much as possible. There's also research showing that the more variety of plant species there are, the greater the plant health is and the greater the soil health is. And I think it's partly because of the associated underground relationships with different kinds of fungi and other organisms. The more different kind of plants you are, the more organisms are getting involved with protecting their health. Leaving the leaves on the ground feeds the soil as well as it feeds the plants, and then always removing invasives. Okay, I was thinking about time. I'm going to skip the pesticide page. I think I've talked enough about how destructive they are. So ways to limit pesticide use are don't use it yourself. If anyone's hiring a landscaper, don't let them use it. One thing that people don't always think about is if you're buying organic foods, it means those plants have not been sprayed with pesticides. If you're buying inorganic food, the farm is using pesticides. So I know that can be a cost issue. But if you can buy organic, that's helpful for the ecosystem. And then there's legislation and ordinances that can be supported. I have a page of how to get involved with pesticide regulation in the resource slides. There are organizations that advocate for limited pesticide use. So I'll give you that information. And then some other ways of maintaining a landscape to support pollinators and other life is to provide water. Insects and birds need it if you don't have a natural source for it. If you have a dish with water, you can put pebbles in it so insects can stand on them while they drink. And then there's Dark Sky International is an organization that's doing a lot of research on the effects of nightlight. It was started by astronomers because our skies have gotten so bright they couldn't see what was going on in the galaxy anymore. And then there's a lot of research showing that nightlight, it's bad for humans. Everything on Earth evolved without bright artificial light on all night. In the last 50 years, it's gotten more and more and more pervasive. So ways to minimize it are to use yellow spectrum bulbs, not cold blue, low wattage bulbs. Leave your lights off if you can, or put them on motion sensors, and have the lights shine only where they're needed. The night lights disrupt bird migration. There are a lot of pollinators out at night, and it really is very destructive to them. I think that's one of the big causes of the decline in the moth populations. So, and we have to adapt we always have to adapt to change. Now we have to adapt to climate change. So I just want to give this as an example. No matter how well you've chosen plants that suit your site conditions, things are going to change. So you really have to keep an eye out and see which plants are thriving and which aren't. So I had this native ginger in my front yard in Cambridge in the shade, and I started noticing, it was happy for years, and then we got more and more intense heat and periods of drought, and it just started getting brown by the middle of the summer every year. So I moved it to my backyard, not far away, and it's just cool enough there away from the asphalt street that it's perfectly fine. So you've got little microclimates, on your own property, and it's good to be always paying attention to how your plants are doing and if you have them in the right place. So when you're looking for native plants, this is Wing and a Prayer Nursery in Cummington. Again, you want to get native plant species, not hybrids or cultivars. This slide is in the resource slides. You want to get plants grown without pesticides, plants grown from seed if you can. And there are native plant nurseries, I have a spreadsheet of them. But if you're shopping in a conventional nursery that has some native plants, it's good to tell them what you're looking for. They're actually starting to change their practices. There's more native plant nurseries popping up because more people want them. So it's good to keep communicating what you look for because that's going to influence what becomes available. So I'll give you this tab of nurseries. And I just want to say we're facing serious environmental problems, but this is really a way you can take action and make a difference, and it's also just really a joyful thing to do. You're like watching nature come back to life, and you'll see new species that you didn't know before, and it's just really inspiring to get to know them. So I'm going to take 2 minutes and go through my resource slides, and then we can have questions. So this is what everyone can get. And if you want, they'll be on your website, so that's probably the easiest thing to do. So I have 2 pages of a summary of the garden practices that I just talked about. These are native plant spreadsheets and lists for different conditions, but I want to show you a sample of what's in the spreadsheet. You get the Latin and common name. You can see when it blooms by month, the color of the plant, the height, how far apart to space them, what kind of light and shade it needs, what kind of moisture it needs, and then it goes on if it's deer and rabbit resistant, salt tolerant, drought tolerant, if it's going to spread like crazy or grow in a tidy clump. So I have hundreds of plants in these spreadsheets, and you can use them. They're helpful for people. These are ways to consider what to let grow in your lawn, what to add in your lawn, what to avoid in your lawn. This is what I went through about what to do when you're plant shopping. This is a page about organizations that are very actively involved in limiting pesticide use and doing research. So if you want to get involved in that, you can check that out. This is information about why honeybees are a problem. And these are places to do more native plant research. I got a lot of the information from the spreadsheets from these websites, so I don't want to spend too much time, but they're really worth looking at. These are local organizations that are involved with pollinator and habitat protection. So I found a few. There's Bee Friendly Williamstown. There's some pollinator-friendly resolutions in very nearby towns. Then my organization, Mass Pollinator Network, or Native Massachusetts, and there's a few more that are all in Massachusetts or nearby that have educational resources, speakers, books, webinars, just great information, and places where you can connect with people if you want to get involved in a group. These are national organizations with also wonderful information. Newsletters that are very informative and often very amusing, but also have things like local events. And these are all really helpful books. And then I wanted to end in the class just before my talk. People were talking about sort of what they might want to focus on next year, and someone talked about spirituality and habitat. And if you're interested in that, I really recommend Robin Wall Kimmerer, who is both a biologist and a Native American, And so she brings both perspectives, her traditions and scientific research, to her understanding of nature. And she's just a great speaker and writer. So this is a quote from her. In some native languages, the term for plants translates to those who take care of us. And we need to take care of them now, too. So that's it. And I'm happy to take any questions. Thank you. Thanks. Yeah.
What species of bees would you recommend beekeepers to take care of other than honeybees? Because I know honeybees are common to take care of.
Yeah, actually, none. The best thing is to provide habitat for native bees, because nature really, if you have the right habitat, the bees will get everything they need. I mean, that's what's amazing to me about evolution. If you think about the millions of years these different species have been, and organisms have been interacting and figuring out how to thrive, they actually do it better than we think we can. And I know there's a big urge for humans to like jump in and take action, and sometimes the best thing is to let nature do what it does. So I would recommend creating habitat, you know, planting native plants, leaving the landscape in ways that they can thrive through the whole year, so that they have places for shelter, for safety, for reproduction, so that they can come back year after year. But we really don't have to directly take care of them other than create safe, kind of restore the habitat that we've taken away so that they can thrive. I don't know if that's disappointing, because it can be exciting to take care of bees. I know there's always some people who are disappointed when I talk about honeybees, because it's an exciting thing to do. But that's my best answer. Yeah, in the back.
Can you name a few of the keystone species for this area?
Yeah, so there is a list in the resource slides, but in terms of trees, oaks, maples, cherries, willows, all provide food. They're host plants. There's some others that I'm not thinking of. And then in terms of herbaceous plants and shrubs, high bush and low bush blueberries are really beneficial. Goldenrods. And I should say about goldenrods, they don't cause hay fever. And there are many, many different kinds. There are goldenrods for sun, for shade, for wet soil, for dry soil. Some of them spread like mad. Some of them grow in tidy clumps. So no matter what kind of landscape you have, there are goldenrods that you can grow. And they're super beneficial to many insects. Asters are too. So those are the ones that come to mind. But there is a list in the resource slides too. Yep.
A few years ago, I started a small business where I was collecting, resourcing native seeds from a variety of organizations that do it, in the right way, organically.
Yeah.
However, these organizations or companies were doing it, they're all over the country. Mm-hmm. So the species is the same, in the Northeast. Mm-hmm. But what is your opinion on ecotype?
I know. Right. That's controversial. I think if you can stay close to home, that's best. There isn't any specific research showing that it's actually problematic to bring a different ecotype in, but I did hear someone speak recently, actually at the brown bag lunch I was talking about. He noticed that the ecotype for lupin for Lobelia syphilitica, that blue plant, it looks really different from the one that you would get from Prairie Moon Nursery, which is in the Midwest, which is a big supplier. Those are really thick and they reproduce faster. And he was worried, if he brings those in, is that going to have an impact? We don't really know. So if you really want to be safe, you could try to stick with local ecotype, but there isn't really proof that it's a problem. So I'm kind of on the fence about it. I feel like it's important to give the insects the plants that they need, and we need to do research. So I can't give you a really definitive answer. We need more researchers. Yeah.
Is there a particularly pernicious invasive plant in this area?
There are a number of them. There's Oriental bittersweet. It gets these beautiful orange fruits, so people used to like grow it because it was a great Christmas decoration to bring into your house. That's one that spreads like mad, and it's another one that climbs trees. There's Phragmites, which is a grass, which I've seen growing along wet roadsides that, again, takes over areas. Black swallowwort's probably more in the east. I don't think I've seen it that much. It's a shorter vine with kind of heart-shaped dark green leaves. Japanese knotweed, yes. Buckthorn. So there are burning bush. Yeah, a lot have been brought in by the horticulture trade and then turned out to be invasive. I mean, burning bush turns a beautiful shade of red, but birds eat the seeds and they poop them into the woods and then they take over habitat. Yeah, so I can actually, let me just make a note. If it's not in already, before we post the slides, I'll make sure there's some resources for finding and identifying invasive plants in the area. I'll make sure that's in there. Yeah.
Any tips for successfully converting your lawn to a pollinator garden?
Yeah, my favorite thing to do is, and it helps if you can, there are faster and shorter ways and slower ways to do it, but put cardboard down. Everybody's getting everything shipped, so you can buy cardboard. If you can get big boxes like from a bike store or something, that's best. No plastic on it, no shiny material, just plain brown cardboard. Cover the area. You're going to smother it. Put 2 or 3 inches of some kind of compost on it. Leaf mold is ideal. And smother it for 6 months is ideal. If you're kind of impatient, wait 3 months. Or do it right away, but then you risk grass coming up that you're going to have to weed. But it's just going to rot into the ground. It'll smother the grass. The grass will rot into the ground and provide nutrients, and then you can just plant whatever you want right into it. Yep.
What month should we start that?
Oh, the smothering process? Anytime. It's like my son's about to start a garden, and we should have done it in the fall, but we didn't. And so we did it right now, and so he's probably going to plant into it in about a month. It would have been better to give it 3 to 6 months because the grass won't be completely rotted, so then we're going to have to do some weeding. So you really can start any time. But the best times for planting, I would say, are spring and fall. It's gotten risky to plant in the summer once it gets hot, especially if you're trying to, when plants are young and their root systems aren't established yet, they need to stay moist. So it's kind of problematic to plant in a hot summer, especially if we're going to have another drought, which we might. So I recommend spring and fall. Yep.
Do you have any comments on, certainly the Asian jumping worms have been a big problem around here recently, but also that I'm hearing that even traditional earthworms aren't native to the area. So how does that play into the insects and plants and soil health? Yeah,
the earthworms that have been here a while aren't native. I don't hear as much about them causing problems. The Asian jumping worms, I've seen less of them since we've had 2 years of drought, but it doesn't mean they're not going to come back. So the problem with these worms is there are ways you can look up to identify them. They look somewhat like the earthworms we're used to. If you touch them, they thrash around like crazy, which is probably to help them not get eaten by birds or something. But they eat voraciously the leaf layer that's on the ground. So they're most destructive in forests where, again, that's where leaves fall and they just stay, and they're plants that have evolved for their seeds to sprout, and it's called the duff layer. So when they eat through that in the woods, it's destructive to, it makes it really hard for these plants to survive and come back. In the if you have them in your garden, I just keep replacing the leaves. And I have not seen them really harm plants. I've seen them, when I got them and I didn't realize, sorry, I keep hitting my microphone. I didn't realize I had them, and I had some plants in pots, and I didn't realize that the worms had gotten into them, and the plants started looking bad, and the worms were busily eating everything in the pot and eating the roots, and those plants really suffered. But when I just have plants in the ground, I'm not really seeing an effect. I just replenish the nutrients. So you don't want to spread them because they are harmful to the ecosystem, and we don't really know what's going to happen long term, even in our gardens. So, for instance, it can be a nice way to save money to swap plants with people. But if someone has jumping worms, you don't want to take their plants unless you've really thoroughly washed the roots off in water on their property, not your property, because you don't want the seeds to be sprouting on your property. So let me add that too. I don't remember if I have this in here, but I have a slide for problems in the garden. It has rabbits, invasive plants, and jumping worms, so I'll make sure that's in there. And scientists are working on, trying to figure out what to do, and no one's really come up with anything to stop them yet. There is a way to find out if you have them, and I think that's in that article. You make a mustard mixture and you pour it in the ground, and it just irritates them and they come up to the surface. But it doesn't kill them, so.
It doesn't kill anything else, does it?
No. Mm-mm. Any other questions?
If that's all today, I'll say if you have any lingering questions come up, I think Amy will stick around for a couple of minutes. Thanks all for coming. Great questions. Please come back next week. And thanks so much to Amy for coming.
Thanks, everybody.